So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming. My name's Kirk Brooks. We're going to talk about subforms, form controllers, and then a little bit about inherited forms. Roughly, this is what we're going to cover. I made some updates to the demo database, and like over lunch. And let me invite you to go to my GitHub location. If you're not familiar with GitHub, I'll be happy to show you how that works. And if you're familiar with GitHub, it's just github.com. My name, Kirk Brooks. This is going to be the top repo on there, and you can download the latest and greatest. I had a little bit of trepidation always when I come to present at these things, because you never know what they're going to roll out in the first 2 days, and then by the time you get to here, it's always possible that whatever I was going to say has already been obsoleted. But in this case, that's not the case, because I heard people talking about subforms quite a lot. The form controller that I'm going to talk about now is a technique, actually, that I think you will find very helpful in preparing for the transition to this dot notation approach that or object-oriented approach that 4D is moving toward. I've been using, I've been using this for the last few years. For the last few years, I've been using strictly dynamic variables on my forms, okay? And I use JSON and C objects quite a lot in that. Using a form controller helps a lot. And a form controller is simply a project method. It's no plugin, it's no component, it's nothing fancy. It's a project method that you simply identify as being a form controller. Now I have a couple of suggestions about what it should be. First, you want it to be self-contained. And by that I mean that it should be able to be called from anywhere and anything and run without an error. It needs to recognize how it's called. Object names are your friend here, okay? And object names are your friend if you're going to be using dynamic variables, so you can see how these things start to work well. It needs to be able to respond to any form action. Object forms obviously fire the form events, but your form controller is the thing that's going to receive them and then decide where it needs to go or what needs to be done. And finally, since we're dealing with forms, in this case anyway, that are part of the user interface, you need to be able to quickly and effectively inform the user about things that are happening while the form is being used. So let's take a look at more reasons why you should use it. I like this, because this is 4D. 4D is this multi-tool programming interface that has all these widgets attached to it. They give us all this capability. Then in a lot of mature databases, I see that guys have been developers have been working on for a long time. There is a tendency, because 4D has such a rich tool set, to try to use all those tools in everything. And that gets really confusing. It gets really confusing on a form when you go into one button and perhaps there's one strategy and one set of tools being used. You go to another button right next to it, there's something else being done. You go to the form method, there's something else going on. Form controller is something that brings that into a little more focus and a little more organization. So we're going to look at what a form controller looks like, and we're going to start with the header. A form controller is going to take 0, 1, or 2 parameters when it's called. 0 is important because if it's 0, I'm going to show you that by putting it in the object scripts of all your form objects, then this right here just pulls the name of whatever that object is into the form as what we're going to call the action. So if I've got a button accept, well, that's going to be the name of the action. That makes it really convenient to keep track on your form controller of what objects you've got on your form and what they're doing. This option of calling it with a parameter allows you to call that form controller in any of those actions without it having to come necessarily from an object. Now, why would you want to do that? testing is always a really difficult thing on a form. Being able to call programmatically the code that you've written for specific objects is a great way to test it, because you can do that from anything. There are also times, that also means that you can call it recursively, as we'll see. So we're looking at where we came from, then we're going to do the work. The work is a big case statement, where we simply look at all the actions that we have defined. Now, obviously, in a production database, this can get to be quite a long list. Also, in a production database with a really big form, this can get to be a really long list. There's nothing wrong with writing helper methods to branch out of here. Okay? In fact, I'm going to encourage you to do that. But having all of that information in one place, having it chunked up in terms of what it's doing, like I like to put it in buttons, fields, form objects. If I do have a multi-page layout, I may tend to put another break in there and put one of those in for each page. Whatever's appropriate. It's going to be different for different methods. But this makes the logic of the form visible to you from the get-go. At the bottom down here is where we're going to inform the user of what's going on. For demonstration, I show returning a long integer variable. Sometimes it's useful to do that because then you can key a reject off of whatever comes back or not. Frequently, I don't use that, but what I always have is a custom alert dialog that does nothing if the message is empty. And so the way the action will work, if we fall through here and we've generated no message and nothing to tell the user, then we're simply done. But if we're executing through here and we do encounter an error, then it hits the bottom and it tells the user right away. And then finally, I like to use this area to identify the dynamic variables. Because dynamic variables are great, but you have to address them specifically every single time. And if you're replicating that through all your objects, then that gets to be pretty clumsy. So this little demo is going to show creating a form controller. Now, obviously, you want to have a macro to do that, and I included this macro in the demo database. So what we're doing is we're just making a method, making the form controller, running the macro. I like to copy the name, make a new form. I actually do work this fast, by the way. And then the first thing I do is put the form controller into the form method with a form events action. So that's going to get anything that is a form that just is the form method in general onto the form controller. Now I made a button. I'm going to give it a really creative name of button 1. This is in V15, by the way, so this is all stuff that you can use right now. For the button method, it's just the name of the form controller. Now, if anybody's ever duplicated objects on a form with code in it and then forgotten exactly where you put it, you may like this. Because now I come back over to the form controller, I type in, actually I mistyped, the name of an object. And I'm just going to use the error message for a little message to say, hey, here's what we did. So that's all looking good. Now we're going to go over here and we're going to run the form. And we get our 4 buttons. And right there, oops, it said that I had an error. It was undefined. And the problem was I spelled button wrong. So we go up there and we run it again. Now, this is a simple thing, so it's using the same box, but this is exactly what we programmed it to say. And if I click one of these where I forgot to write anything yet, it tells me. This is really helpful. This is really helpful anytime you have objects to duplicate on a form and you want to make sure you get it. So now let's go and let's just play with this some more. I'm going to put something in for button 2, just to hammer this point home because I think this is good. But also what this shows is if you were doing this without the form controller, right, you would have to close the form, open the object method on button 2, change the code, reload the form, and run it. With the form controller, because everything is just already referencing that project method, you can make changes on the fly right there on the project method, and then they are available right away, unless you're changing a variable reference or something like that. And finally, so down here in the form events section, this is the part that's going to fire or going to run when the form method runs. So typically, we all do our setup in onload of the parent form. I do that. Why do I have this down here? I'm going to get to that later. There is a reason. So what I'm doing here now is just for fun. You know, I'm putting in a little for loop. We're going to iterate through these 4 buttons. We're going to set the title of the button to the button number. And this is, you know, this is just to illustrate how when we load the form, we call this method with the form events action. And then here we can evaluate any of the form events, just as we would if we were simply operating on the form method. This is really helpful, as I was saying, if you have a mature database, if you've got an old database with forms with, you know, pages and just dozens of stuff, duplicate the form, make the form controller, and then I will just start from the form method and copy it and paste it in, replace it with the reference to the form controller, go through all the objects and do that. At the end of that, you have a miserably long method, but you also have finally a visual representation of what is going on in that whole form. And then you can start to identify the similarities, the replications, and hopefully tighten it up. This approach works with any form. I use it on my subforms, I use it on my input forms, I sometimes use it on output forms. I use it almost exclusively on forms anymore. If it's a very simple form that is doing 1 or 2 things, has a button or 2, I will still sometimes put the, just put the logic in the objects. But anything more involved than that, I think it's a real mistake to put large amounts of business logic in form objects, because they're locked away on that form. You have no way to audit it. It's hard to test, and they can be hard to find. And I'm going to once more reiterate, this makes working with dynamic variables much, much easier. You heard that we should really be abandoning using process variables on forms anymore. And, you know, so all those buttons, all those fields, all those list boxes, all those pop-up lists, all the things that for years we've just been associating with a process variable. You need to be able to do those things without the process variable. You don't have to use this approach to do that. But if you do use this approach, you'll find that it allows you to limit the amount of code that you have to spend identifying those variables every time you call it. Because if you don't do it all in one place, you know, you can't put that in another method and then like run that method and have it return the pointers. I mean, you could, but that would be even more clunky. This way, all that stuff is right there. Any questions about that?
Say that last part again. You can't put it in another method. I missed what you were saying.
Well, let's say.
What is it in that sense? You can't put it in another method.
Sorry, I need to dereference that, don't I? So going back to the example I put up there with, you know, like the button 1 object. Yep. Okay. As a dynamic variable, I have to get a pointer to that, or use a command that refers to it directly, you know, that can take the object to name. You can't do that by, you know, by like handing off that reference to another method and then have that method come back and tell you what it was. You know, we can do that with other things, but you can't do that with dynamic variables there. So if you're going to do something with that variable within the variable itself, you have to get a pointer to it. If you want to address it, you know, like change the title from the load command, then you have to get a pointer to it or use the object set name command with the name, and so on and so on. By moving all this stuff to that single method first, then you've only got one set of that identification stuff to do. Good question, thank you. Anything else? Okay. So let's talk about subforms now. Like I said, I was delighted everybody was talking about subforms so far. This is great. I like subforms. But let me say also first that I'm specifically here going to be talking about subforms used as a UI element, and if you're working in V15 or earlier, then only subforms that are what are they called input subforms. The list type subforms that you may have encountered if you've been around for a long time, I believe I heard today are now officially deprecated. I never use them anyway, so I wouldn't be able to speak about them anyway. Subforms are a great way to write generic code. All right. Once more, if we're looking at modularizing and compartmentalizing as much of our 4D work process as we can, then a subform is a nice way to do that. They're very flexible. In the demo database, you're going to see I show you how to use one as a toolbar. I use some as an input form. I use some, in other cases, I use them as a container for list boxes. You can do quite a lot with them, and consequently, they are widely misunderstood. Or at least this is what I gather from reading the NUG. Some of the things I like to use list boxes for. They're an alternative to or a container for, subforms for, as an alternative to or a container for list boxes. For special processing, the 4D widgets are the canonical example of that, but they're also good for tools, toolbars and controls as an alternative to multiple pages. And that was touched on in an earlier session as well. Was that Thomas Mall was talking about that as an alternative to having, a form with large numbers of pages. You can have a single page with a subform area, and then you simply define multiple subforms for the material that you need to display, and then change that subform out in that one object. That is a lot less code. That's going to be a lot less load in terms of consuming resources, and it's going to be easier to manage. And of course, components. I'm not going to get into components here except to acknowledge them. But obviously, subforms are the way that you also are able to reference forms from a component. So subforms are list boxes. I think subform is more modular. I think this is an important point. Subforms are a separate namespace from the parent form. And as you start working with names more, that starts to really be profound, because it means that this is why you can duplicate a subform object. And if you remember one of the examples, I think it was, I forget which one it was, to be honest, I'm sorry. But he showed the contact database, and they had a little window, a little card for each contact. Well, that was a subform. I don't think they called that out, but that was a subform. And so that subform was obviously having the same names for the objects within the subform. So the subforms operate in their own separate namespace. I find them better for array-based list boxes because of that separate namespace issue. And for those reasons, I find them easier to replicate. I think people like list boxes because they're not a subform. Once more, and they're easy on simple stuff. I'm not up here to offer absolutes about anything on this. There are perfectly legitimate reasons to use them, but they do share the namespace. So if I put a list box and I'm using an array-based list box, and I'm using dynamic variables for the columns on a form, and if part of my interface is that I want to put some stuff in there and then allow the user to duplicate it to look at something else in the same way, if I have that in a subform, then all I have to do is reconfigure it within the subform. If I do that on the parent form, those dynamically named columns in the second subform are going to have a second list box are going to have a separate set of names from the first one. Is that a problem? Well, maybe. You know, it depends. If you're going name base, it's going to be a problem. If you're good at getting pointers, not so much. So again, there isn't an absolute. It's just a design choice. Special processing. What is that? The date widgets are an example. The subform is the date variable itself. That only works with process variables, by the way, I found out doing this, at least up to version 15. It may have changed in 16 and later. Subform can be any kind of data type. In version 15, that's the basic ones: text, long integer, real, date, picture. I think those are it. In V16 on, it can be a C object, and I think in V17 on, it can be a collection. Okay, we'll get to why that's important soon. So that makes it good for widgets. Toolbars and controls. Again, there's a great, well, I shouldn't say it. There is a toolbar example in the demo database, and they're good for putting a simple face on a lot of complex operations, because the processing that goes on behind a subform can be quite extensive, whereas the user only needs to input one or two things. The fact that subforms can be simple, I think, escapes people sometimes. You know, you can make a subform with absolutely no coding. And that would be the case when you're using them as an alternative to multiple pages. You know, you can make it's a perfectly legitimate use of a subform to simply have labels for the field names and the fields. And that's it. If I have an input form and I display that subform, the user can enter data into there. It's going to be just as though I had a multi-page form. The data is simply there. If you save the record, the data are saved. If you do not save the record, the data are flushed. And if you change to another subform, the data is still in the, in the unsaved data cache. So, don't think that a subform has to be a complicated thing. It really doesn't. They can be quite simple. And components I already touched on. So now, let's talk about how a subform and the parent form exchange data with each other. The first opportunity for a parent form to exchange data with a subform is by what's called bound variable change. The bound variable is the object on the form, on the parent form, that the subform is in. And I'm going to ask, are you comfortable with that idea? Because I get the sense from mainly what I read on the NUG that a lot of folks have a hard time with that. So, and I think it has to do with the fact that we talk about the same variable from two different directions. When you're in the context of the parent form, we're talking about the subform object is the variable we're talking about. When we're in the context of the subform, all of a sudden it's the bound variable, but it's the same variable. It's referred to differently depending on the context that you're coming to it from. The other thing the parent can do is you call execute method in subform. This is great. This is especially great if you've written a form controller, because it is a way for you to use the same logic that you've identified, or access the logic that you've identified for your subform from the parent form without having to make special things. you simply call the form controller from the parent form in the context of the subform. I know, that sounds spooky, doesn't it? And then the third thing you can do, from the parent form, you can get a pointer to objects on a subform. And I have a little demo of that coming up shortly that'll make that really clear. So now let's be in the context of the subform, and we need to communicate back up to the parent form. How do we do that? The big gun is call subform container. So in the context of the subform, something's happened, and we need to notify the parent form about that. Call subform container is the command that sends this custom form event to the parent form. And this is where, if you've looked at the docs at all, you suddenly see this like negative number showing up. If you've used some of the widgets, you've probably put them on a form sometime and been running it, and then you're getting this -1 form event coming out of who knows where. It's coming from the widget, which isn't a bad thing. But but it's like, what is -1? The value is arbitrary. It can be anything. It's recommended that we use negative numbers just to avoid confusion with the regular form events that 4D uses as positive numbers, but it doesn't have to be. You can use it to mimic a form event. I recommend against that. But that's the easy thing. Second, as I said, is to execute the parent form's form controller method. You can call that. I have an example of that. But for all these things, the context is the key. And the context is thinking about where the code that is running is called from. If it's called from an object on a subform, it's going to run in the context of the subform. It's going to know about the objects and the object names on the subform. It's not going to know about anything on the parent form except its parent form container. If I'm calling something in the context of the parent form, the subform, I know more about the subform, but I can only address them in two ways, either by getting a pointer to an object or by using executed method as we described. So let's play this. Here we go. So hopefully to illustrate this in a way that will make sense, we're going to make a parent form. I'm going to put a variable on it. I'm going to make it a dynamic variable, and I'm going to name it form title. Now I'm going to make a form controller, and this is going to be very much like we did before. Call the macro, and I'm going to copy this and follow my best practice and go put this into the form method first with the form actions or form events action. Now we're going to create the demo subform. And to show this point about the distinction in the namespaces, after I make this, I'm going to make another variable there with the same title, form title. So we're going to have, and then I'm going to put the subform on there. So we're going to have this situation where we have two variables with the same name but in different contexts, and therefore not sharing the same namespace. Once more, I really do work this fast.
Excuse me, sorry. Is that video playing? I missed that.
Yeah.
I was like, this is magic.
No, I have my assistant underneath there. Yeah, no.
Watching your toes.
I have great respect for guys who can stand up here and do public programming like that without just collapsing into a heap of tears. I did not want to test myself at that level. Okay, so what I wanted to do is I just wanted to put some stuff on here. So we've got the same sort of button situation that we had before. I've dropped a list box on here. I've made all the variables dynamic variables, so there's no process variables going on here. And now we're just gonna, we're gonna do some stuff. So here, this is the demo subform form controller. And so the form events section here is going to look for this on-bound variable change. So that's going to fire, as the message is saying, when the parent form puts something new into, wait for it, into this object, which is the subform object on the parent form. And you notice I also made it a dynamic variable. I think I'm going to come down here and disable all of the form events for this. I generally don't use any of the form events on the subform object because you don't need to enable anything for that custom event. It's going to percolate up there whether you enable it or not. It just will. So you don't have to add a whole bunch of events to it. Okay, so now we have this object. I made it a text. I'm going to go ahead and link this up to the subform controller, parent subform controller. And here, I'm going to use, I think it's -200 is going to be my custom event. Okay, so when this object on the parent form receives a form event of -200, that part of the that script is going to run. And now to set up the subform, I'm going to use execute method in subform, call in the subform object. I'm going to call the subform objects a subform controller, and I'm going to call it with an action that I've called setup. Okay, so when the parent form loads, I'm going to execute this method in the subform right here. The method we're going to execute is the subform method controller. And in the subform method controller, I defined an action called setup. The great thing about that is I can call that setup from here. I could call it when the form itself loads. If I called the form by itself, I could put that in the forms onload event. I could call it from something else. That is a convenient way for me to reset that subform anytime I need to, just by calling executed method and telling it to set up. And you see also what I was doing was just playing with different ways of addressing these variables. Did everyone see that? Should I back that up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not sure where the -200 form event comes from. I mean, that's your own invention, but I'm not sure where you're setting that.
Okay, well, let's, oops. Come on. Well, that's unfriendly. Here, let me do this. Let me drop out of that, and we'll just go. Oh, there it is. I'm sorry, this is getting clunky. Okay, let me run this from. That won't work. Well, I apologize. I had a set of tools for controlling this that is not available when I'm in this mode. So I am unprepared for this. And I can't make it run faster. Well, that's a rookie mistake on my part. Well, okay, we'll just go through it again, and I'll try to remember to stop it at the correct place to demonstrate that. I can't. The -200 event is generated by a button on the subform. And it's an arbitrary thing. You know, I was just doing that to make a point. So it just calls subform container -200. That's all there is to it. Because the subform only has one container. So it doesn't need any parameters except whatever the value is going to be. And then the method on the parent form catches that event and then executes whatever you have set up for it. If you don't have anything set up for it, it just passes through.
So the 200 gets sent from the parent to the subform.
From the subform to the parent. Right, this is setting up the subform, creating some objects on here, and putting the subform controller into the object, duplicating the object. That little trick works just as well on subforms. Setting up some stuff in this Listbox. This is a defensive programming technique. I know Miyako talks about it a lot, and I was really resistant to it for a long time, but let me suggest turning off all the form events and then enabling them as you need it is a great way to demystify weird stuff happening on your forms. Okay, so now we've set up the subform object. Just to reiterate again, in version 15, I almost invariably make them text. And the reason I do that is because I very frequently use them, make the content of them a stringified JSON. That's a convenient way to move data back and forth, because then the subform object really just becomes a data object. And the subform is just manipulating the data in that data object. Okay, so this is the context of the parent, right? And this is where we will respond to that -200 event. And again, in the context of the parent, I'm going to call the setup function in the subform. And I wrote that setup event action on the subform controller when I was writing it. And that statement, that execute statement, can be called from anywhere within that process. Okay, and so there we set hello world because we got the pointer to the form title hello world, and that gave us the one on the parent form. Object get pointer takes a third parameter, which is a subform name, and then that allows me to set this variable directly from the parent only, and only from the parent. You can't go down levels to lower levels of the subform. And so right here, we're doing, right, this is button 1 on the subform. It's going to call this method. This method's action is button 1, so then we're saying just call the subform container with -2. So that is where the -2 comes from. It's whatever number you want. And in the real world, in production, this is a great place to use constants so that you can give that a rational name instead of just negative this, negative that. Oh, crap. Okay, I'm gonna move on now because this is the other really important thing about form events and subforms. Form events are trapped on the subform they occur on, with the exception of onload and on-unload. So think about that. That's one thing about your UI design. If you place a subform, you can place a subform over something else. User clicks on it, that click stops at the subform. However, when we load the form, onload and unload the form, populate through every single object and every single form and subform involved. So as an example, the black outline is our parent form with a button. The red outline is a subform of the parent form. And then this red subform itself has a blue subform, and that subform has a button on it. What could possibly go wrong? The thing about onload, so we load this form, and what happens? The very first thing that fires is the blue button onload event. Then the blue subform form method. Then the red subform's subform object method. Then any objects that might be on the red subform. Then the red subform's form method. Then the black button method. Then the subform object method from the black form. Then any other objects on the black form. And then finally, the black form's form method, which is where most of us would be looking, thinking we're doing the setup for the whole stack. And the fact is, that part of the code is going to be the very last part of the code to run. First thing to keep in mind. We know that the objects will run before the form events, but 4D doesn't guarantee any other sequence of execution on that. So if you've ever tried initializing some subforms with some objects and you thought, oh, I can just put a little, I can just tell the object to go look at this and then initialize itself like that, and it didn't work. Now you know why. Because that code was running before your parent form probably had selected the record or the specific data that you were trying to reference. This is a good thing to keep around as you're getting comfortable with this. Finally, let's touch on inherited forms. Inherited forms, let me ask this, does anybody not know what inherited forms are? Okay. An inherited form is a form that you can design, and then when you create a new form, over in the form properties box, you can choose inherited form and you can identify that form. And all the forms that you put the inherited form on will show that inherited form on them. Before subforms, they were a great way to do things like include, like make up toolbars. They're still, I think, a good visual reference. But for anything involving any kind of programming, I would really recommend taking a look at using a subform to accomplish whatever you were doing. If you put a subform on the page 0 of your parent form, then that's exactly like an inherited form, except you've got way more configurability. But this table I made up to show basically compare and contrast a subform with an inherited form. The only real gotchas in here might have to do with the fact that an inherited form doesn't trap clicks. And an interesting thing that I discovered, I don't know if it's a bug or not, but the inherited form shares the namespace with the parent form, but doesn't enforce exclusivity. So with that example I had about the form title, if I have a inherited form that variable or that object name on it, and I have a parent form with the same object name, and I put that inherited form on that parent form, I can get a pointer to the inherited forms version, but there's no way to get a pointer to the parent form version. I filed that with 4D. I don't know if it's a bug or it's expected behavior, but that could really be annoying if you didn't know about that. So, to wrap this part up, form controllers are an effective approach to organizing methods and your forms. Subforms offer options for improving your user UI. And together, they make a powerful combination. And with that, we have about 15 minutes left. We can talk, I can answer questions, or we can take a look at the demo that you have, and I can show you some of this stuff in a little bit more detail. Shall we go to the, let's go to the demo. What the heck? Who doesn't like a demo? Let's see, I think I'm going to mirror. Great. Okay, so this is the demo, and again, I encourage you to download it. Interestingly enough, I'm just going to point this out because I was surprised how many people were really impressed with this. This little hello box is a web form, a web area that I put together. It's got a link to the place I got the demo data from. Some people, like, David Adams, for some reason, was just really impressed with this. Huh? Like that? You like that? Huh? And so, okay, enough of that. Here is, let's go look at some of this stuff actually being used. Well, you'd think I would have this load better. So here is, here is a form, perfectly nice form. This form is made up almost entirely of Listboxes. I'm sorry, of subforms. The colored bar at the top is a subform toolbar. It happens to be, in fact, I'm going to bring this down. It happens to be exactly the same subform and toolbar that this is made up of. This in itself being in a subform contained here. And then I have this list box over here. And so a cool thing about this is I have my buttons on this that are able to change the selection, respond to things. Now, this subform is actually very simple, because I wanted to show you, you don't have to have any fancy programming. This one is simply, there is no programming on that. Those are just the objects on the subform, and then display the subform as we choose a new contact over here. This toolbar is configurable with the with the buttons that you want to have, with the image, with the icons that you want to use for it. It all works off of a JSON config form. You can either write those config forms ahead of time, store them in the resources folder, and then load them. Or you can load some templates and then configure it in the form. So you can do it on the fly, you can do it ahead of time. I really like being able to do that. By the way, to be able to, establish configuration in a JSON file that I can ship with the product and that I can change the look of a form. I can, you could change anything without having to go in and change anything in code. That's very cool. And I would go so far as to suggest, we were seeing some of the upcoming object-oriented techniques that are on the way. Those look very comfortable to me, having been using this stuff for the last couple of years. And it's not that the work I've done is going to just convert instantly over, but I can see it's going to be a step for me to convert over to object, to the 4D object-oriented language, without having gotten familiar with this. I think it would be a more intimidating jump. So this is a way, these are techniques you can start playing with now, start incorporating now, that'll get you ready, that'll get you positioned to make those transitions with less pain than folks who don't are. But this input form is entirely subforms. Once more, here's my toolbar up here. I've got 4 subforms on here, one for the name entry, one for the email, one for the phone number, and one for an address. I configured, these can be configured, again with a JSON, so that if it's a required field, I want to put a red border around it until it's filled in. And let's just play with this a little bit. That's cool, that's nice. There's 2 objects on that subform. There's the rectangle and there's the field. I did make these others required. But let me show you this. Okay, well, that capitalized. That was nice. There's nothing really special about that. How did I do that? Anyone?
Command limited?
Anyone? No, I mean, how did I open that little window? Yeah? Yeah? You ever tried to do that from a subform? You know what happens? It opens only in the space of the subform. So to make it go bigger than the subform, because I wanted to be fancy and I wanted to have it, when it opens, I wanted it to cover the subform to force the user to have to deal with it. Well, it's in there. And this is one of the more complex parts, so I'm not gonna go into that right now, but I'll just briefly describe what happens is, so this menu is in the context of the subform, okay? This executes in the context of the subform. It calls the subform container. It says, hey, here's these fields. You need to display these. I have a little module in there. It's called pop-up list. It's yours now. And all these things basically are things, by the way, you should be able to just put into your projects right now and play with. So the parent form calls the pop-up list module, opens this little subform with the list box in it, reads the fields into it, and gives me the opportunity to edit them. Oh, that's terrible. And then when it gets closed up, it gets read back. It gets read to the subform object as a JSON. The subform object gets called and says it needs to do its setup. Part of its setup involves writing the display to the screen there. This is one of those complex operations that can be made really simple on the user side. There's some amount of work to do that. I mean, because there's checking. And by the way, I have a little routine in there for checking addresses. It's awful. I put a note on there. I said, don't use this. I mean, don't use that. It's terrible. I did it just for the demo. So once I do this, then I save myself. Come over here, and there I am. All that's with subforms. Okay, we have 5 minutes left, so let's do some questions now. First, I'm impressed everyone is A, still here, and B, still awake. Thank you.
Any other questions? I've got a microphone.
Bao goes first, and then we'll get you.
Thank you. That was a great session, Kirk. I have a question regarding you mentioned inheritance forms and the subforms. You had a very nice kind of comparison. So, can you tell exactly what limitations you're referring to? Is it like development time takes longer in inherited forms, or is there specific features you have which which will take a lot of work in inherited forms? Or
Right. Why am I
something we
throwing
can't do?
shade on inherited forms?
Yeah.
Well, they are actually faster. There's no
Right.
question about that. You can do them quickly, and to be honest, a long time ago, I wrote, a fairly elaborate set of routines for doing a lot of the same things in inherited forms that I'm showing being able to do here, like multiple
Right.
buttons and changing stuff. If I was going to be really honest, I would say that is some of what I was going to present here when I started working on this last year. And then I realized that it would be like selling last year's model to you. Because as I started working with it, I just realized that a subform toolbar, as you have the module for now,
Right.
gives you so much more flexibility. It is so much easier. It's easier to understand, it's easier to configure, and you get a much larger payoff from it.
Sure.
So that's the reason I'm standing here suggesting that.
I think
get
you're
away
right.
from the
Inherited forms
forms.
became painful. They become painful over time. So thank you.